we'll get started. Just to make sure everybody's in the right place in case anybody needs to run out. This is concurrent session A, Truth, the First Casualty, War Rooms, and Rumours of War Rooms. And none of us up at the front here is Shannon Dobb. Unfortunately, Shannon came down with a bad case of the flu and was grounded by her doctor, so could not come from Vancouver to join us. So we have found more than adequate replacement, whom I will introduce to you right away. Whenever I find myself in a meeting with these two, and I often find myself in meetings with these two, I'm reminded of and I'm going to date myself here, reminded of the song, These Are the Daves I Know. So these are the Daves I know. First, right beside me here is Dave Cournoyer, who is a writer and communications professional based here in Edmonton. He's the publisher of the Alberta politics website, daveberta.ca, and host of the Dave Berta podcast. He has a BA in political science from the U of A, and in 2015 was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Edmonton New Media Awards for a decade of online writing about politics in Alberta. He currently works as a communications advisor for the United Nurses of Alberta and lives with his family in Northeast Edmonton. The other Dave is Dave Climenhaga, journalist, author, post-secondary teacher, and trade union communicator who has worked in senior writing and editing positions at the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Calgary Herald. He's also employed as a communication advisor by the United Nurses of Alberta and publishes the albertapolitics.ca blog, which is also reprinted and carried on rabble.ca. So I am told, I got a little worried when they both used the same word explaining what was going to happen today. I am told that they've got good shtick. So I don't know what that means, but we're about to find out. So I will hand it over to Dave and Dave. Go ahead, guys.
Okay, Okay. Thank you. I thought Ricardo was going to say that we reminded him of the two Ronnies, and if you get that reference, then automatically you are subject to the OK Boomer comment. So anyway, now if I'm a little unnerved, I'm hearing my voice echoing back at me, and I've never worn one of these things before, and it is a little unnerving watching the microphone floating around in my peripheral vision. So anyway, what I think we'll do is we'll start. We've got a little slideshow talking about the inquiry and the war room, which is kind of deals with the known knowns, right? The facts that we have access to at this point, and then we'll just get into some speculation, hopefully not too idle, about where this might be going and what it all might mean. So I need to. I guess I need to.
Here's the remote.
Yeah.
There you go.
One of my bad habits is I use my own slideshows as my notes. So here's what we know about the War Room. It's based in Calgary. It's been given a $30 million budget, which is not huge in the scheme of things nowadays, but it's a significant amount of money from it would certainly ease my retirement plans if I had that much in my bank account. It's been officially renamed the Canadian Energy Centre Limited. The legal headquarters is a Calgary law firm associated with the Conservative Party, the United Conservative Party, and it's been structured as a private corporation to avoid FOIP searches. So that the argument that's been used for this is that we mustn't give away our plans to these foreign-funded environmentalists who are trying to maliciously defame Alberta. Dave, you got anything more on this?
Yeah, I mean. One of the things that that I think will be a theme that we'll talk about this morning is that what does it mean that some of these initiatives, the War Room, the public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns, both of these initiatives as part of Jason Kenney's fight back strategy that he initially announced last October in a speech to the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and then came out in more detail about following the UCP victory in the provincial election. Both of these initiatives have been structured to kind of block transparency in terms of neither of them are fall under FOIP. So media or public interest groups who are interested in learning more or trying to get some transparency around these organizations or these initiatives, they're essentially blocked right out of the start gate, and that's by design.
you'll probably hear us say a couple of times, but this might well have been a pretty good election strategy. And it was clearly thought up as an election strategy at the point when the UCP was not the government. For a governing party, I don't think it's as good a strategy. It's problematic, and I think it's problematic for them as well as for everybody else, or everybody who's interested in exploring the issue or an honest political discourse in Alberta. Okay, what's happened?
Oh,
Okay.
there you go.
No, I pressed the wrong button, I think. I had it behind my back, and I was trying to be smart. So let's talk about the War Room personnel, and these are some of these people I know. There's a former Postmedia business columnist named Claudia Catanay was contracted to create the corporate structure for it. And this was just a temporary contract. I've worked with Claudia. I know her. I think she's an uninspired but reasonably capable writer. Former Postmedia political reporter, strikebreaker, Stelmach spokesperson, UCP candidate, and country singer was named the titular head. And I guess my original notes said former Postmedia political bloviator, strikebreaker, unsuccessful Stelmach spokesperson, failed UCP candidate, and lousy country singer. Now, we know that Sonia Savage, the Energy Minister, Doug Schweitzer, the Justice Minister, and Jason Nixon, my personal favorite Alberta politician, comprise the board of this private corporation. So this is a government-owned private corporation. This may be what is it? An entity that's sui generis in Canadian history. I don't know. It's not. They say a crown corporation. It's a private corporation, but it's run by and for the government, which raises a whole whack of interesting questions. When I made this slideshow, we thought that there would be close involvement by the Solberg family enterprise, New West Public Affairs, in this. I'm not as confident at this point. Dave's made a contrary argument to me that's persuasive that that's necessarily the case, but they've certainly played a role in the UCP strategy and in the strategy leading up to this. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about them. And the inspiration for it, and also the other activity that the government's involved in the inquiry, is the debunked conspiracy theories of Vancouver researcher Vivian Krause. And I think I don't want to, there have been people have mocked Ms. Krause for being a nutritionist because that's her background, but I think we can have expertise in an area without actually having our training in that area. So I don't want to indulge in that. But at the same time, I think the idea that there's a foreign-funded conspiracy has been pretty thoroughly debunked, particularly by Sandy Garacino of the National Observer. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, many of you in the room probably would have read the report that Sandy Garacino put out to the National Observer, the deep research that she's done. Many of you may also have read yesterday the Muttart Foundation here in Edmonton put out I think they submitted a 174-page submission, including quite a bit of research into this kind of debunking this myth that foreign-funded organizations are behind funding anti-pipeline and anti-oil sands campaigns in a huge, meaningful way. I think in terms of close involvement, we don't really know who's involved in the War Room, really. Last month, Tom Olsen was appointed as the managing director, and since then, it's been very quiet. We haven't really heard anything about the Canadian Energy. What is it called? Canadian Energy Centre.
And I want to call it CECL as in a corporate name, because if they want to call it a corporation, then we should treat it as a corporation.
And we do know, and speaking of corporations, we do know who's been lobbying to try to get involved in the War Room. We saw over the summer Postmedia, which is the Toronto-based company largely owned by American hedge funds that owns basically almost every mainstream newspaper in the country, had hired a lobbyist to lobby the Alberta government to basically help see what they could do to help the War Room. We've also seen the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers hire a registered lobbyist to lobby basically along the same thing. So we have Postmedia and CAP both trying to get in on, perhaps a little bit of the $30 million and figuring out what, but it's not totally clear what exactly the War Room is going to be doing. So we have these groups lobbying to be involved, but what the war room is actually going to do, how it's going to operate, is still largely unclear.
And we're prepared to theorize or to speculate on what that might be, but probably in a completely uninformed way. So this is Claudia Catanay. I'm a believer that people like to see the people we're talking about. So I've got a bunch of pictures here, and I won't dwell on them too long. This was Claudia's columnist picture from the National Post, and as some of you will know, I have a vast collection of photos of journalists and politicians in Alberta of my own, and they're sometimes quite unflattering, but I like them because I own the copyright to them. But I couldn't make that claim in this case. As I said, this is Tom Olsen with the Premier as he likes to see himself. And this is Tom Olsen as others see him. And here he is back in 1999 or 2000 crossing the picket line at the Calgary Herald. And now I want to tell you something about that Tom always, and if I slip into calling him Tommy, I apologize, but that was always my bad habit. But Tom was an assistant city editor at the time, and I believe he said to people that he had to cross the picket line because as someone in management, he had no choice. I want everybody in this room to know that I was an assistant city editor at the same time, and I was vice president of the union, and I never crossed that picket line. So that's a good story. So here we have the board. Jason Dixon back in his Wild Rose Party days. Doug Schweitzer looking just totally clued out, and Ms. Savage, the energy minister. These are just pictures I snapped, in Nixon's case, not so recently, but recently in the legislature. And these ones I had to drag off their website, but these are the Solbergs, Monty, Matt, and Michael. Monty is the father, and Matt and Michael are the sons. So they're certainly influential in the way things are being propagandized by this government. But So now let's talk about what we don't know. We don't, as Dave has already touched on this, we don't know the number of employees, their pay, their terms of employment, how long they're going to be employed. We don't know who will really run it. We don't know what their reporting structure is or to whom, because it's a private corporation. I mean, I guess it's a completely private corporation, so they won't have to publish a shareholder report. We don't know what will be done in-house or subcontracted. Obviously, as Dave noted, Postmedia hopes some of it will be subcontracted to them, or really what the work will actually be. These are interesting questions that occurred to me. That will it continue to exist as a corporate entity? Imagine that the UCP falls in 4 years or 3.5 years. Well, we can hope. Can board members, corporate officers, be sued for defamation or harassment? And I think this is something that they didn't think about when they created this entity. They thought, hey, well, this is a great way we can escape FOIP. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can escape court action by people. So if you're defamed, if anyone in this room is defamed by them, you should think about these options. And then that leads to the next question. Must taxpayers pay the corporate officers' defense bills in the event there's some kind of legal action?
Why is it so important for them to avoid FOIP?
Well, like I say, their excuse is that they don't want this sinister conspiracy that they claim exists to know what their plans are. But I suspect really a lot of stuff this government's doing, and we've seen a lot of this just in the last few days, falls into what I would call the general definition of a boondoggle. And they may not want people to know just how much of a boondoggle this is or in whose pockets this money is ending up. Oh, that's a very unkind characterization, but that's my view. Dave?
Yeah, in terms of one of these points, what the work will actually be, will it be done in-house or subcontract? But what will it actually be? Will this be a body that is in charge of pro-Alberta advertising campaigns? Will it be a body that is in charge of, hanging out on Twitter and correcting opponents of pipelines and correcting opponents, or arguing with opponents of pipelines and arguing with opponents of the oil sands? We don't, as I said before, we don't really know. One of the interesting things, I think, when you look back at Tom Olsen's history, some of the initiatives he's been involved in government, when he was involved with when he was working for the Stelmach government in the late 2000s. I don't know if you guys remember, if you're on Twitter now, you'll see the @YourAlberta Twitter account. It's like the official Government of Alberta Twitter account. Well, back when Your Alberta was initially set up, it was this whole kind of campaign to, in a very similar way, kind of shift the message around the energy industry and around the oil and gas sector in Alberta. It was very much seen as a bit of a propaganda tool. But they were producing kind of, I guess, what would be described as fake news. If anybody's familiar what Doug Ford's government is doing, I think it's Ontario News Now is the kind of news station, online news station that operates out of the Premier's office. It was very much trying to do something like that. It was the official government line, but packaged and produced on YouTube and on social media in a format that kind of looked like a news report, looked like news coverage. You had someone going around doing interviews with a mic. So there is a question of will they take that kind of an angle? I mean, it may just be a body that launches big advertising campaigns and tries to get meetings with New York Times columnists or Washington Post columnists and that kind of thing. But it may be something else. Maybe they may be trying to actually make it an actual kind of news information center for the government to push its message.
Yeah, Tom was also involved in advertising, not necessarily with the same branding, but you guys will remember the case of the Northumbria Beach or whatever it was. I might have the beach in England wrong, but where they had an advertising campaign about how great life was in Alberta that showed a picture of a British beach, and on the east coast of England, and much hilarity resulted. And Tom, this was one of the fumbles I spoke of, was rather than saying what took perfectly reasonable response to having done that was well, it was a mistake, it was a mock-up ad, and we let it slip into print. We're sorry, we're fixing it immediately. Everybody in this room would have understood and been sympathetic to that because we've all done things like that. But instead he said, no, that was part of the plan. We chose that because we wanted to show that Alberta had worldwide appeal, which to me is a real dumb response.
That's quite the spin there. That's quite the spin.
Yeah, this is not successful spinning.
So one of the other things that I think is important when talking about the War Room is Premier Kenney mentioned in one of his speeches, I think it might have actually been to the Calgary Chamber of Commerce again, or maybe it was the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce. It was one of the business groups, but he mentioned that there was a potential for opening overseas offices where the energy war room would operate out of. Now, I don't know what exactly that looks like, and he talked about opening offices in key media markets. We know Alberta has international trade offices already around the globe, but mostly in Asia, but also in London, Mexico, Washington, D.C. Premier Kenney just announced last week that Alberta was going to open offices now in Vancouver, Quebec City, and Ottawa?
Ottawa, British Columbia, and Quebec was the way it was put.
So I mean, perhaps the War Room has something to do with that. But there really is just a lot of speculation at this point because they've announced this big thing, they've appointed someone in charge of it, but we haven't really seen what exactly the War Room is actually even supposed to be doing.
Yeah, when I mentioned boondoggles earlier, at one point in my career, I was hired by the Calgary Herald to cover agriculture as a business reporter. And I am a believer in going out and talking to people who do the jobs I'm writing about. So I spent a lot of time on farms, and I got to know the smell of that stuff that bulls produce. And there's a whiff of boondoggle about this that sort of has the same kind of smell.
Yeah, I think David's right in terms of what he said earlier. In terms of this is something that sounds really good on the campaign trail. It's a great talking point. They're going to have a fight back strategy. They're going to build this war room, they're going to have this inquiry, they're going to do all this stuff, but when you actually form government and it actually comes to actually putting this in motion, it's probably not as easy as they thought it would be.
We should remember when we're opponents of political parties that have done very well in an election that they're not all powerful just because they've had a success. There are always combinations of circumstances that lead to particular electoral results. It's not a sure thing that the UCP can be defeated, but they can be defeated. So these kind of things start, to use Dave's phrase, they start to establish the narrative. That the way this is going off the rails now establishes the narrative about the kind of government they are. That will be useful to opposition parties in the future. So now let's go to the inquiry. What's the so-called public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns? Which is a highly tendentious way of putting it, if you ask me. It has only a $2.5 million budget, but they're going to need, by the sound of recent news reports in the last week, they're going to need an infusion of additional cash because Mr. Allen, the commissioner, has already spent so much of that, some of it on his son's law firm. It's been launched under the Public Inquiries Act, which is interesting too. Mr. Allen is a Calgary forensic accountant and a marketer, and I think really, I mean, he is a qualified accountant with a specialty in forensic accounting. So he's obviously not a dummy, but really his most recent job has been marketing Calgary, as trying to attract business to Calgary from other places for a long time. So maybe he got a little too much into the marketing way of looking at things. The structure will be he'll conduct a paper review with an interim report by January 31, 2020. So that's pretty soon. So he's been off gallivanting around the world doing something. We're not privy to the details. You're not privy to the details. The government doesn't want us to be privy to the details. Based on that review, and I took this from the government's press release, the commissioner may hold a public hearing if necessary. Final report after the public hearing, which may or may not occur, will be July 2, 2020. Now, I think there's actually a fairly significant chance there won't be a public hearing, because of the way the wheels are starting to fall off the bus, Dave? Yeah.
I mean, just in terms of the timing of it, I mean, January 31st, 2020 is coming very quickly. Yeah.
Okay. So this is Mr. Allen. I've subsequently found a better picture, but when I made this slideshow, I didn't have it. That was the one I used on my blog yesterday morning of him in the cowboy hat with the Calgary skyline photoshopped behind him, out of date Calgary skyline. So is it an inquiry or is it an inquisition? I think this is a fair question. What's the objectives of this? The website famously included an email address for tipsters that was widely mocked as the snitch line, and now that issue, though, that's interesting. That was the first strike back, the first thing that people reacted with, but that has proved not to really have legs. That's kind of, that issue of whether they're taking tips from the public has kind of fallen out of the discourse. As I said when the last slide was up, the terms of reference are both tendentious and highly contentious, by which I mean they try to get us, on reading them, to draw a conclusion about what the conclusions of the commission will be. They're telegraphing what they're going to report. So this kind of is like the McKinnon report. We were told that we were going to have this blue ribbon panel who was going to look into Alberta financing, although they weren't allowed to actually talk about the revenue side of Alberta financing, which is not a very responsible way to look at that question. But it was widely said, based on what Janice McKinnon had already written, these are the conclusions she'll reach. She'll look for about a 3% rollback for public employees. And sure enough, well, they've upped the figure a bit. They say on average 2%, but for UNA, the organization I work for, or we work for, they are indeed asking for a 3% rollback. So this was all telegraphed in advance. We knew perfectly well, but the same thing, the publicity about this and the things that we know suggest exactly the same thing, that this is this isn't a real inquiry. It's an effort to bully and embarrass people that they disagree with, and it's already got predetermined conclusions. So I don't know. I might be wrong about that, but that's certainly the impression that this kind of setup gives. It's based on a false premise. For over a decade, a well-funded foreign campaign has defamed Alberta's energy industry and sought to landlock our oil. There are certainly opponents of tar sands developments, for example, who that would be an apt description of. But how well funded this is, I think what Ms. Garacino's work shows is that it wasn't very well funded at all compared to other groups, and it's certainly not very well funded compared to what the oil industry can pour into its countervailing propaganda. It comes from Ms. Krause's theories, and statements by Premier Jason Kenney suggest that the intention of the inquiry is not to find facts, but to name and punish opponents of oil sands development. And that really is a problem about the whole legality of this process, or even there's an argument been made that it's not even allowed it doesn't even follow the Public Inquiries Act, which requires the inquiries to actually try to find out the true facts. So there's all kinds of potential for legal mischief and legal opposition in the courts, as well as opposition in the court of public opinion.
Yeah. I mean, the outcome is. I mean, it seems like it's very much prescribed. I'd be very surprised if the final report of this public inquiry basically doesn't confirm what exactly it was set out to be, and in terms of what Mr. Kenney, the orders that the government orders that created this public inquiry, and all the political rhetoric that led up to it.
Well, we'll know that they've delivered an honest report if they say, actually, we've discovered that there isn't a foreign-funded conspiracy to defame the oil industry.
Fat chance that's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, this is very much. I mean, it does seem like it is very much. I mean, it is a political witch hunt. It's very much playing into that political narrative that Alberta's situation, current economic situation, is the fault of outsiders. So at one point, in one hand, it's trying to, I mean, it's vilifying outsiders as the source of all our problems. But like many other things Mr. Kenney does, it also creates a list of, I mean, it creates a list of enemies, but it creates a list of excuses as to why his own political program might not be working. I think he's isolating himself. He's insulating himself to criticism. Coming over the next few years, especially going into the next provincial election in 2023, if the massive corporate tax cuts don't lead to the return of jobs, if the price of oil internationally stays stagnant and the Alberta economy doesn't recover, if we're not basically in another boom in 4 years, Mr. Kenney will have a long list of people: Sephora Berman, Greenpeace, David Suzuki, Justin Trudeau, Rachel Notley, public sector unions, Amnesty International.
We'd better be high on that list.
Yeah, Dave Climenhaga, David Cournoyer. Those are the reasons why Alberta hasn't recovered. Why the price of oil isn't at $200 a barrel, and we're not all I don't know, drinking out of chocolate coffee mugs and have golden microscopes.
Yeah, this is, as we all know, as we know from the discussion in the previous session, that this is one of the characteristics of what we're coming to term populist government, is the need to find enemies to identify as the cause of all the problems, rather than the government itself taking any credit for the problems it may have created. So this is convenient, but like Dave said, and like I've said, I think that this narrative is going to become increasingly problematic for Mr. Kenney, because he seems not to be. He's known as a clever political strategist, but I also think, and I can engage in amateur psychologizing because I'm not a psychologist, so I have no ethical rules that I need to worry about breaking. But I think he's an emotional and angry person, and I think that when they thought they were going to win the federal election, the Conservatives, and when the Conservatives didn't, a lot of the plans he had went awry. Perhaps including other ambitions, but they came off the rails too, and so he's kind of struck back and doubled down on a lot of this stuff, and I don't think that will play well for him. If his objective is to win another election in Alberta, that might well work, because we've seen how well it worked last time, and there's a substantial number of people, like the 35% of people in the United States who support President Trump, who no matter what he does are going to support him. But if he thinks he's going to have a success outside Alberta, persuading people to build pipelines, or some things of which should have been quite doable in the context of Canadian politics, I think he's going to find that the approach he's taking now makes that more difficult, not less so. That may suit him internally because it makes it easier to blame the other. But
yeah, I mean, as a result of these types of initiatives, the fight back strategy that Mr. Kenney likes to talk about. I mean, I think that one of the results of that, I mean, it's yet to be seen, but my prediction is and it's worrisome, that Alberta becomes more and more politically isolated, especially on the issue of climate change. We can see the rest of the world, public attitudes are moving in a different direction. We have major international banks pulling their investments out of oil sands operations, out of fossil fuel operations around the world. We have a federal government that is doesn't seem, I mean, they won a minority, the Liberals won a minority, formed a minority government, but I'm sure they're going to move forward on their climate change initiatives because they have the support of other parties in the House of Commons. So, I mean, one of the risks that Alberta takes is, I mean, it may be popular and it may be, in the short term, it may allow Mr. Kenney to win re-election next time and as many times as he wants after that, perhaps. But Alberta risks being isolated within Canada and within the world on the issue of oil and gas, on the issue of climate change. And if we don't take the initiative ourselves, we may have solutions imposed upon us. And I think that's one of the risks and could lead to, I mean, could really define, this kind of stuff could really lead to future basically definitions of Canadian politics and kind of constitutional wars in the future.
Dave wrote a great piece that he published this morning in which he said it's not a foreign-funded conspiracy. The Alberta's problem is not caused by a foreign-funded conspiracy, it's caused by the market. And so what we're seeing, one of the things that's interesting about this is the environmental crisis, the global warming crisis, appears to be moving faster than a lot of experts who predicted it. And at the same time, the market response to that appears to be moving faster than a lot of people in the oil industry and in the Alberta government had hoped. And if I may be so bold, I don't think our previous government was that different than the current one. So.
Gentlemen, a comment here. Are you aware that CAP has a massive budget?
We certainly are.
That it hires Hill and Knowlton to manufacture consent. And this looks like peanuts compared to that.
Well, these guys are all kind of tied in together too. So I think but that goes back to one of our fundamental points: is we think this was set up and then followed through on, as an election campaign technique. Probably. But now it's grown legs and it's got a life of its own.
Probably Hill and Knowlton cooked this.
Well, I don't know about that. But anyway, I just want to continue and to deal with the slides as quick as we can. Again, getting back to my philosophy that you need to know what people look like. This is Vivian Krause. This picture's a little dark, so it's not showing up very much. But she must. I've not heard her speak, but she must be a good speaker because she seems to be on a successful speaking tour. I want to talk quick about legal questions that came up, and these have been raised by a number of different groups. But first of all, it has no jurisdiction outside of Alberta. Mm-hmm. And I was in Victoria, BC a few months ago, and I went to see the leader of the Green Party there. I'm having one of those seniors moments.
Andrew Weaver.
Andrew Weaver, right? And Mr. Weaver told me that I asked him, well, would you go, if you're called to testify, will you go and talk to them? And he started by saying, oh, sure, I will. I love judges' inquiries. And I said, well, actually, it's not a judge that's running this one. It's a guy who's an advertising man and an accountant. And he, what? And he we talked about the background of that for a minute, and he said, no way will I waste my time talking to that group. They got no jurisdiction in BC. Slam, the door closed, right? So if they intend to use this as an effort to bully or intimidate certain people, it's not going to be very effective because of the jurisdictional limitations. I believe the way the Act is structured, if the commissioner is not a judge, the commissioner has fewer powers than if he is a judge or she is a judge. And in this case, I suspect, I can't prove this because, again, none of this has been public, but I suspect they tried to get a judge to lead this or even a retired judge, and they couldn't find one who'd do it because of the problems with the way the inquiry is structured. It's likely to be challenged in court if witnesses cannot have legal counsel or cross-examine other witnesses. And this is one of the reasons that I suspect that Mr. Allen, in fact, will not hold a public inquiry.
Public hearings.
Or public hearing, yeah. The terms of reference suggest it's a witch hunt, not an inquiry, and a legal challenge of that is probably inevitable. Eco-Justice Canada Society has called it a kangaroo court and issued a public statement saying they will challenge it if the terms aren't changed. Mr. Kenney got on his soapbox the next day and said, the terms won't be changed, get lost. In fact, he probably privately put it more strongly than that. So it will be challenged by Eco-Justice. I think that's a given. Amnesty International Canada, as you know, attacked the inquiry. It was mainly a rhetorical exercise, but it had some real impact, saying that there are real fundamental human rights problems built into the way it's structured. Now I'm trying to remember who wrote the legal opinion. Do you remember, Dave? This is one of the Alberta law blog.
Martin. Oh, I can't remember his last name. He's a prof at the University of Calgary.
At the University of Calgary,
Yeah.
who is a law prof, and wrote an opinion saying that the terms of reference suggest that the inquiry is not legal under the Public Inquiries Act of Alberta. So there's a fruitful ground for another legal appeal.
Yeah.
And what we don't know, reaction to potential witnesses in other jurisdictions, we just talked about that, what challenges will come before the courts or when eco-justice will act, although I think it's all a given now, given what they've said, that they will do so. Whether Commissioner Allen will even hold an inquiry, we talked about that, or what the Kenney government strategy will be in the event that it turns into a gong show, falls apart, or is shut down by the courts. Although we can speculate. If it's shut down by the courts, I think they'll do what populist governments always do, and they'll say it's elite jurists who aren't in tune with the people. We heard this in the previous lecture, right? And if it turns into a gong show, they'll double down. That would be my guess. And if it falls apart, well, I don't know what happens if it really falls apart, but they'll pretend it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's also important to be reminded, and we mentioned this earlier, that the inquiry does not fall under FOIP, so you cannot submit a freedom of information request for information about the public inquiry. And we found out yesterday, after the NDP asked for the ethics commissioner to investigate the $905,000 sole source contract to Dentons, that the ethics commissioner also does not have jurisdiction over the public inquiry. So it's very much by design removed from these kind of transparency
But the courts still do. So if somebody sues them for defamation or sues them for harassment, there's a possibility of cross-examination, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the last of the slides. So where should we take it from here, Dave? Do you want to entertain questions immediately, or anything?
Yeah,
more?
sure. Thank you.
That's just the tour d'horizon. And so let us, how do you want to do the questions? Do you want to choose the questioners?
So I guess we've got a couple of mic runners, and I'm seeing lots of hands up in the room already. I think what I want to start with is a question for you guys around, is it really possible that they haven't planned ahead to the moment where this reveals nothing, where this doesn't reveal a conspiracy? Because right now, every speech that Kenney makes, every speech that the energy minister makes, every column from David Staples and Chris Varco and Rick Bell reassert that we've been under attack by these foreign-funded environmentalist radicals who are lying about our energy industry. When all of this collapses, they've got to have a plan for how they're going to reframe this. Like, are they really coming at this not knowing what's on the other end?
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, they don't talk to me. So, I have a suspicion that a lot of them started out really believing this, and they're starting to feel the ice going, making those uncomfortable cracking sounds underneath them. But my guess is what they'll do. This would be my guess, and Dave may have a different answer. But my guess would be what they would do is probably what I would do is try to bluff my way through it. They'll have a report that says something. They'll say, "See, we've proved that there was a foreign-funded conspiracy." If you follow the doings of the Fraser Institute. I've been yelled at by people on social media for saying this, but if you look at the data that the Fraser Institute uses in its reports, it is almost always accurate. So they take real facts from verifiable sources, and they construct arguments that aren't related to those facts. So the press release is what the media picks up and covers, and the press release reaches a conclusion that is unsupported by the facts that they've honestly reported. So I wouldn't be surprised that the same strategy will be seen here, that they'll say that, in fact, when you look at what the report has based its conclusions on, that you can't reach those conclusions from those facts, but they will anyway, and that will be what the media covers. Because really, and I got to put a pitch in about this, is we have very weak, poor quality media now in Alberta and in Canada, and the problem is not the reporters, but the problem is the structure of the industry, the challenges it faces, and the unwillingness of editors on major mainstream media to spend a lot of time in most places on investigative reporting or well-researched reporting. And so what media tends to do is it gets the press release. There's 1 or 2 days of activity. Those ideas expressed in the press release are imprinted in the public's mind, and then the entire issue goes away. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see that'll be their media strategy for dealing with this, Dave.
Yeah, I think regardless of what the result is, I think that they double down on their messaging. I mean, I think that one of the key characteristics of this government is that they never apologize and they never admit they're wrong. So I don't see why they would change their mind.
That also adds to an interesting dynamic vis-a-vis the war room, which I think will start to become this catch-all for everything that they get cornered on. So we saw this week when the Premier's wealthy banker friend got busted for $45,000 worth of outrageous expenses, and they tried to deflect and couldn't. All of a sudden, the Premier started talking about how this was the important work of the war room to defend Alberta, right? So, because if you move it to war room, then it's out of public digging and public sight. Okay, let me see those hands again. Let's start up here with Bob. Who's got the mics? Just right up here.
Very good presentation, gentlemen. I just a comment, and it was made over here, and you made it in your presentation. It's on where investment dollars are going. And in the last week or so, we've seen the European Investment Bank pulling project funding from fossil fuels. We had HSBC moving away. We had the Sweden Riksbank not buying Alberta bonds and Australian, Queensland and other bonds. So just to kind of underline that fact that the whole Kenney economic miracle, as you say, I think is premised on a resurgent investment. But international capital is going somewhere else. And I think people here on the progressive side of things have to flag and emphasize there are alternatives to this in terms of other investments, and capital markets are adjusting.
I think the political phrase might be, to channel Mr. Clinton, it's the market, stupid. And we're really, and there were some assumptions built into, I think, both the NDP and the conservative kind of general forecasting strategy that there was at least a chance for another boom. And one thing that was pushing it that way was the pressure on the U.S. government to get involved in some kind of a conflict with Iran. And I went to Robert Fisk's talk the other night, and one of the things he said is that the Iranians understand the West better than the West understands the West, and that his prediction was that there will not be a war with Iraq. Or pardon me, with Iran. That they will know how to skillfully maneuver their way out of that danger. So the possibility of war in the Persian Gulf would mean the possibility of extremely high oil prices for a spell. And if that prediction is correct, and one hopes it is, that would mean that's off the table as a way to save Alberta in the short term in time for the next election. But it's really, we're seeing I talked in a sarcastic blog post I wrote the other day about how the Swedish Riksbank situation and the response to it, and I noted at the bottom of that piece that Volvo, which is still thought of as a Swedish automaker, plans to move by 2045 into an entire all-electric line, and in what is it, 6 years, they plan to have 50% of their line of cars all electric, fully electric. So this is the way major car makers are going now. I didn't put it in there because I tend to write too long anyway, and then the facts keep piling up and they get unreadable. But what's a really interesting factoid about Volvo is now owned by Geely, which is a Chinese automaking company. So this indicates to me that the Chinese state is also moving toward electrification at a rate faster than we expect.
I think that's optimistic, but I think we're missing where the money's going to come from to continue to, quote unquote, invest in oil and gas, because the Kenney government announced in the budget on October 24th he was taking the ATRF pension fund, teachers pension fund for health, etc., and putting it in Aimco. I don't think we're very aware that Aimco was privatized and corporatized in 2007, 2008. The directors are appointees and big donors. For example, Derek Cates was a director from 2008 to 2015. And the rest of them look like that. And executive management is appointed by the government and looks like that. So they're going to use the Aimco money and the Aimco grab that they're doing right now to continue to fund fracking oil and gas industry. And no foreign wealth fund will do that, or bank, or foreign capital will touch it anymore, because these companies have no ability or intention to honor polluter pay, which was the Supreme Court decision last January, known as Redwater. So they do have plans to fund them, and the companies have plans to walk away, because they've already done that. Aimco funded Trident. Trident walked away at the end of April, left 4,700 wells, has no payback to Aimco, and that doesn't matter to this government. And they've just funded Parady's buyout of Shell, old sour gas wells.
I would say this is a little beyond the scope of our inquiry, but I do want to address your point, because if you have your retirement savings in a public sector pension plan in Alberta, and I'm not going to stop there, but a public sector pension plan, you should be gravely concerned by this, because I think the questioner is right that there is a plan to use that money to prop up the oil industry in the guise of protecting Alberta jobs and defending Alberta jobs. But really what that will be is a welfare scheme in which the money will then, significant amounts of it will exit the country or exit the province anyway for oil company profits. But I say to you, everybody in this room should be concerned about that, because as we know, Mr. Kenney also has his eye on the CPP. And I saw somebody say a very profane comment on social media, but get your grubby blankety-blank hands off my pension. And I think we should be all sending that message to this government, and as strongly as we can. And I think this is a message from a political perspective that resonates very effectively outside the immediate group of progressive people in Alberta, but this should concern absolutely everybody. Absolutely everybody.
Yeah.
It's worth highlighting out that, and this went highly unnoticed too, is that just as recently as March, Aimco bought an 85% piece of a pipeline from TC Energy. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, it's very interesting. We see all the time the annoying Canadian Taxpayers Federation's so-called Ottawa director or federal director, a guy named Aaron Wedrick, talking all the time about how the government money is misspent in his way of looking at it by the Quebec government in Quebec. And so he's forever raising these issues about underwriting supposedly uneconomic companies on the grounds that this will create jobs in Quebec. But this is exactly the same strategy that Mr. Kenney is proposing to use here, I think.
Valerie, can we? I've got a room full of hands of people waiting to ask.
I don't think it's anything but a big coincidence that the Solicitor General, Justice Minister, is a corporate bankruptcy and restructuring lawyer.
Yeah, you were mentioning that this morning, Dave.
Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned earlier that climate change, the climatological data that we're seeing, outstrips the models that we presently have of warming. To what extent can we attribute this to the fact that many of the modelers and ostensible left-wing neoliberal politicians amortize the impacts of methane, which is persistent in the atmosphere of about 8 to 12 years, over a 100-year period, such as when the Notley government spent billions of dollars accelerating climate change by converting coal plants to frack gas?
I can't answer that question. Dave may have some thoughts on it, but because I'm just not well versed enough in the technical question there.
I recommend a Think Progress article. By the time natural gas has a net benefit on our climate, you'll likely be dead and the climate ruined.
Okay.
References a University of Calgary study.
Thank you.
So, and I think that's, I mean, I've heard this a few times now, right? That this transition to natural gas is not really a climate-friendly transition at all. It's just delaying the inevitable. Let's come, actually, Walter, can we stay right here and go to the red sweater right there?
Yeah, just a quick comment. The process you've been describing can be categorized as decision-based evidence-making.
Yeah, that's very well put.
And it's consistent across the government.
Are you asking if it's consistent across the government?
No,
or are you
no,
saying?
I'm saying, the McKinnon report was another good example.
We're just not going to argue with you on that one.
I think it's important not to underestimate how committed Mr. Kenney and the people he surrounds himself are to this ideological project of restructuring Alberta. I mean, you hear it frequently from conservatives that Alberta is a socialist state. And I mean, we can talk about what their views of socialism are, but I think that it's very important to remember that many conservatives view Alberta through that lens, and they view this project, this restructuring project, as something that I think they're fully committed to, and I think that he has a backbench full of MLAs that are willing to go along with it.
We've heard it said that by conservative governments in particular, but not just them, that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Mm-hmm. But one thing we know about the neoliberal approach is that if there's no good crisis, create one.
Yeah.
And so there's an element of creating a crisis here too. And that's where this whole Wexit thing comes from, I think, is that, well, let's create a national unity crisis that has no real fundamental basis here in Alberta, and use that to push our agenda.
Yeah, and you see it. I mean, when the budget came out, and even before that, you saw it on an almost daily basis. There was a new crisis, new chaos being sown. A lot of it is building political narratives. It's distractions. It's trying to keep the opposition off foot. But I think it is part of a grander scheme.
I think the two Daves should take their show on the road, don't you?
We have to work some of the one-liners up a little bit.
I have a question. You mentioned eco-justice, and I think it was over a month ago when eco-justice wrote a very detailed letter to the anti-Alberta inquiry, outlining several legalistic reasons as to why it wasn't a legitimate inquiry. And I think, and then they requested, or they asked for a response to all the points that they made, and they asked for that response within a month, right? And I don't think there's been a response.
See, I've just been complaining about media, but I should have followed up on that. So.
I don't think there's been a response, which would indicate that, following what you said, I think eco-justice will now act.
I think they'll act soon. I mean, this is what this was the way eco-justice phrased their letter, which I don't have a copy of it in front of me, and I couldn't read it with my glasses off anyway. But what they said was that we find these flaws with the way you've structured this thing. You need to fix them. Here are our suggested fixes. If you don't act within a month, then we're going to take you to court. So they gave them an out in a sense. So as I say, the very next day, the Premier came and said, we're not changing anything. They can drop dead. So yeah, I doubt that they have even responded.
I don't think they have responded, which would indicate to me that now eco-justice will undertake some kind of action.
I would think so, and this is
in
going to
terms
end
of
up
going to court themselves, right? Yeah.
This is going to end up getting mired in the courts. The other thing is if they dare to call any witnesses and not allow those witnesses to cross-examine Vivian Krause. I was getting mixed up with the singer. Vivian Krause for the accusations in effect that they are responsible for this conspiracy, and then the Premier's threats that we'll wreak revenge on you if you are responsible for this conspiracy. Then there will be legal moves, I am sure, to get an injunction to stop the inquiry. So this whole thing could get very tangled. That's why I think, again, their lawyers have to be telling them, if you start calling witnesses and interrogating them in an uncooperative or in an unfriendly fashion, there's going to be immediate action in the courts, and this will get shut down. So I bet you we'll never see a public inquiry.
Well, and I think it's beyond calling witnesses, right? Because you'll notice that the Premier and the Energy Minister are both very happy to name names like eco-justice and groups like that, but the Inquirer himself is not naming names for that same reason, I think, is that they're terrified that they'll get caught up in kind of legal lawsuits. Let's go up top there. Next question, please.
Hi there. So first off, I want to echo the sentiment that you should take this on the road. I think that there's a lot of people at the Alberta NDP who maybe need a bit of a wake-up call to stop buying into some of the framing that Jason Kenney and his government are using to frame the Albertan economy, and should maybe remember that they don't have to say, oh yeah, Vivian Krause, she's great. They can say that this stuff sucks. But anyway, what I was going to ask was, do you think that there is a potential for this public inquiry to start targeting Albertan activists individually? I know that Jason Kenney's tweet guy, Matt Wolf, already does this to a degree with some Albertan activists, like naming them publicly on Twitter and trying to associate them with the NDP. Do you feel like that might intensify this like naming and shaming of like individuals in Alberta? Or do you think that Jason Kenney wants to sort of stay away from the sort of possibly negative public appearance of, you know, picking on like 20-year-olds like on Twitter using a giant taxpayer-funded media inquiry thing? Or do you think that he is going to just go all in and start really doing the witch hunt stuff and amping that up?
Well, my thought is that that was the plan, that they intended to do that, and they thought they could really get some. Action from that. But I think they're starting to have some doubts about it now. Because for one thing, if I were the leader of an environmental group in Alberta, I would want to be called and I would want to be bullied, because then I would have a wonderful platform to push back at them, to fundraise, to make them look like goofs. Okay, so that's my quick response. I think we're seeing what they're planning changing. Dave made a comment a moment ago about how they'll pluck the conspiracy out of the air when they're trying to find an excuse for what David Knight Leg is the high-quality hotels he's staying in, and the champers he's drinking with toffs from the city. Now, look, I have a question for you. If we take it on the road, what do you think we should charge?
Well, and then and I would just correct one thing in the statement you made before the question, is that it's not so much that the Premier is trying to, or that Matt Wolf is trying to tie the activists to the NDP, but the other way around. Trying to tie the NDP to these Alberta-hating activists, right? I think is how that's playing out. Let's go up there.
You mentioned that Postmedia lobbied to participate in the inquiry, but just to underscore what Ricardo said earlier, in my estimation, there are active participant already. I mean, hardly a month goes by that Mr. Staples is not writing at least one or two articles, mentioning the foreign investment.
That's a very fair point, and it's not just staff columnists like David Staples. It's people like Franco Terrazino. I might be mispronouncing his name, but the
Taxpayers Federation.
He's the Canadian Taxpayers Federation so-called Alberta director. Their Alberta directors don't, or their provincial directors don't actually direct anything. They usually live in their mom or dad's basement, and they don't. And so, if you notice, if you go to their website and look where their offices are, they just have post office boxes. But he's, Dave, you did the work on this. How many times has he been published in the last?
I think he's been published in the Calgary Sun, and sometimes, but I believe sometimes it's been syndicated in the Edmonton Sun. But in the Calgary Sun, basically once every 2 weeks for the past like 6 months, with the exception of a bit of a break over the summer. But he very much has these organizations, these right-wing organizations, have regular columns inside of Postmedia newspapers.
Every 6 months or so, they try to restore their virginity by having a columnist with an opposing point of view. But that doesn't happen very often. It's basically just the same group of people, a whole bunch of staff columnists who write the same kind of thing, but a whole bunch of regular people that they draw in from other sources too. So you're right, they're doing that. But I don't actually think that lobbying is the right term of what they were doing. I think they made a business proposal, just a standard business sales call to the inquiry, to the war room, pardon me, asking if they could, they said, we're in a great position to provide the editorial services that you will need to spread this message that you're producing.
But they had to hire a lobbyist under the rules and register.
They kind of play the game of saying, well, there's a division between church and state, as we used to say in the newspaper business, and the advertising department does what it does, and advertorial type material is part of the advertising department's mandate, and the news department does what it does. But you can see on this issue that the lines are extremely blurred to the point where the news department is acting as an advertising department for the government policy. But it's not. But it's in post media. It's not just Alberta. This is true with the federal Conservative Party, and it's true in other provinces.
Next question is up there.
Hey there. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the funding structure of the War Room. So if you look at the budget, it looks like it's more 80 million than 30 million. And a lot of that revenue stream is actually coming from the TIER program, which is the very flimsy pillar of a very flimsy climate plan, kind of nominal carbon tax on large oil sands producers. So it seems like the oil industry is funneling money through the government to promote itself while also greenwashing itself. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, it's my understanding that, I mean, of the 30 million that was initially mentioned, 20 million came from TIER and 10 million was supposed to come from, it's the Public Affairs Bureau, whatever they renamed it. It's like Communications and Public Engagement. Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's from my understanding of where those funds were going to come from. I mean, yeah, I mean, they're using funds that, might otherwise have perhaps gone to climate change initiatives. Instead, they're pumping it into what is essentially a $30 million public relations subsidy for the oil and gas industry. I mean, I'm aware of how much money oil and gas companies have, especially some of the larger ones. I don't think they need very much subsidy. I especially don't think they need subsidies when it comes to public relations.
But this goes back to the whole opacity of this exercise, right? It's set up so that it's hard for us to know things like that. And clearly one of the things I think it's like getting your press release reprinted by the newspaper as if it was their story. If it comes from the government, I think for a lot of voters in Alberta, it has more credibility than if it comes from Imperial Oil or from CAP. So. Yeah. So they're happy to use the money laundering process that the government allows them to do.
Either my mic runner up there has gone rogue or that row has taken him captive and stolen the mic from him. Go ahead, Mishka.
I want to thank both of you for your overview. I found it personally, and I know all of us did as well, very helpful to summarize some of this. It does pose a question, and my question is, given your sort of analysis and pulling all this information together, what should our response be? What do you kinds of things, and the we there is very big, I mean, whether it's individuals or groups or something, but in terms of creating, I guess, a kind of an alternative narrative or a counter-narrative. Because I think it's one thing to know about it. I think it's quite another to start to try and change the conditions that allowed this to emerge in the first place, and that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. So what might be some things that you think might be countervailing or might be effective to move in not just against something, but also for what we really need to be doing?
That's an extremely
That's a great question. That's a really good question.
It's an extremely good question, and it's quite difficult to answer. And I don't really have a political strategy for countering it. What I would say, one thing that I acknowledge is true, is that for every country on this planet, for every national entity on this planet, foreign-funded campaigns, corporate campaigns included, are a problem. But you can't pick out one slice of the pie and attack that. You've really got to have it. So maybe we should be pressing at the federal level for, I'm thinking out loud here, but for a national inquiry on foreign-funded influencing of Canadian politics and what we do about it. Because there is a real problem, as Ms. Garcino's work shows, the portion that's going to anti-tar sands campaigns is extremely small, extremely limited. But the amount of money that's coming in from other things, including directly via money laundering, in effect, from the U.S. government, is really quite profound. So this should be an issue for everybody, everywhere, in what you do about it. And the other thing, I think, to some degree, we just have to deal with it, because to grow up and deal with it, because social media being what it is, it's very difficult to shut down. So we cannot do in a free society like the government of China does and say we're just turning off the internet now because it's saying stuff that's bugging us. And as long as we have an internet where I can go to American sites and British sites, then we're going to have access to contrary views about how we should run our country. It's always interesting how people have no problem if somebody from a foreign country steps in and advocates their point of view, but we always object when it's someone else's point of view. We heard the conservatives crying about Mr. Obama recommending that we vote for Mr. Trudeau. So, well, that's kind of the way it is.
And I think it's important that when talking about how to create, and I don't have the solution, but talking about how to create alternative political narratives around these issues, it's important not to be, and we joke around up here, but it's important not to be too dismissive of the fact that these ideas resonated with a lot of people, and there are reasons why they resonated with a lot of people, a lot of ordinary people, a lot of workers here in Alberta, and trying to figure out as progressives why those ideas resonated and how we can create compelling counter-narratives, I think is key.
Okay, Mike.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, Dave Squared. It's a great session that you've put on this morning. I want to talk about a comment that I heard in the question period here where it was about being identified by the war room. And it got me thinking about our actions over the last year at HSA when we were speaking out and we started getting targeted a little bit. In Calgary right now, the Calgary Board of Education is being vilified a little bit. And it's not really war room, this is more of an overarching government piece. And I'd like to hear a little bit more, as you watch this government being targeting and vilifying the Calgary School Board by saying it's your fault that you can't find $40 million in cuts to your education system in Calgary. And these are the pieces that I think, and as I look around this room and I see leaders of civil society and I see leaders of labor unions, we are all going to be selectively targeted at some point, and we must find a way to work collaboratively. And how do you I guess your thoughts on that whole piece. Thanks.
Well, I would say there's kind of a different process here. Mike is the president of a major healthcare union in Alberta, and so through the labor relations legal structure that we have in Alberta, you're going to be targeted a different way. They're going to try, I think, to pass legislation that says you can't spend money on what we define as political action. And so there's a structure for that we've seen used by neoliberals in the United States to shut unions up, to weaken unions, to get them out of to get them worrying about their survival as opposed to worrying about the shape society should take. So that's a real problem. But I would say with unions and to some degree with school boards, because they're directly funded by the provincial government, the attack is going to come directly at them through other legal means. This is a way to extend this to groups that are not as vulnerable to the kind of pressure you're talking about, because they're just members of civil society or they're even citizens of other provinces. And so, this goes way back 20, 30 years, but one of the things talked about in the back rooms of conservative political parties when they get together and meet internationally is how to defund the left, was the phrase, the way they used to describe it. So they're looking at ways to at least limit the effectiveness of their philosophical opponents as well as their opponents on specific policies. And this is not going to stop. We need to think creatively and we need to push back. I mean, one thing I think is going to happen, I was thinking this morning as I was driving in here, Mr. Harper, the former Prime Minister, is the head also of an international conservative party organization that does campaign in other countries. So if you're worried, we can't really use this, I don't think, this is what I was thinking about, you can't really use this argument against him in Canada because he is a former Prime Minister of Canada and he is a citizen of both Canada and Alberta. But if you were a German or a Belgian or living in Zambia or wherever in the world, then I think the same kind of things that are being said about the foreign-funded environmentalists could be said about the foreign-funded neoliberals who are led by Stephen Harper.
Okay, so we're coming up to the end of time. I've got two mics out there, so I'm going to ask Verna and Annika to make very, very brief comments, and then I'll invite all speakers to wrap up. So, Verna, if you want to go ahead.
A very quick one, and that lovely lady that talked about the Aimco. I have been working for the last week on that, and I was terrified to find out that the Edlin column pointed out that in 2017, the two clauses 5 and 6 that set up a good standard for the directors has been erased. And it's now being appointed by the minister, the directors. And after we saw what happened within Canada with 8 out of 12 directors from the US, no wonder they went south. My concern is we have the chair of that is former Enbridge. At the moment, we're probably fine, but what are we going to do is there a legal way to sue? As a pension fund, the moral obligation is to raise funds. Secondly, what are we going to do? There's 37 of groups involved, and if somebody like that lady would be the contact person, and the ATA and all of these should be doing the proactive work right now to say we don't want that pension money going to the...
All I can say to you is I've asked myself the same questions, but I'm just not an expert on pensions, and particularly the governance of pensions. So I cannot give you a meaningful answer on. But I do think there needs to be. There are cases where political action and people in the streets works best, and there are cases when legal action is also effective. And I think this is a case where both things need to be happening. People who are concerned about their pensions in Alberta need to be going to making appointments with their MLAs and going to see them locally and saying, "Get your grubby hands off my pension." But at the same time, this is clearly a case where legal roadblocks need to be thrown in the way of this. But I'm not a lawyer, and I can't tell you how well that would work or what you would do.
Annika, very briefly.
I have two things. I have a good message for you. It is witch hunting, and I saw that coming, so I already took a course at the University of Alberta in how to deal with witchcraft and how to use it here. And I have some secret information on that. I also have very serious information, because in a way I grew up after the Second World War in Holland, and I want you all to think about Hitler. He very soon came up with similar methods, but they were quite dreadful. Can we not taunt this Kenney Jason and tell him, "You're not doing it right, it's not good enough, it's not strong enough"? Or should we use the other argument and say, what about freedom of speech? Let's join the freedom of speech. We may have to find allies with that. Let's taunt them. Let's have biting sarcasm. And let's maybe do public, whatever puppet shows to show how totally idiosyncratic this is. And come to me if you want to know about witchcraft. I know how to use it.
Thanks, Annika.
Well, maybe the province can launch a witch hunt for witches as well. But
but part of what you're talking about is actually, and Dave talked about this in the slideshow, is part of the reason they stopped advertising the email submission line is because it got flooded with people mocking it. It got flooded by emails of people just completely mocking it, so they stopped promoting it, right? I'm going to give you guys the final word if you want to say a couple of things to wrap us up.
Dave?
Just thank you very much. This has been a great morning.
Thank you very much. This has been very enjoyable, and I've learned some things too. I particularly appreciate the information about the backdoor funding of the inquiry and so on. So we'll add that to future presentations we make on this. I'm pleased with the endorsement that we should take this province-wide, but I'll need advice on how to do that.
We got our Alberta 20-city tour.
Yeah.
So just a couple of
Are there that many cities in Alberta?
Yeah. We'll find out.
A couple of really quick announcements before I thank our guests one last time. First of all, lunch will be served in room 17 right now, which is like right next door here. If you're in line and you see one of our tech people come up to line, or see our 1 p.m. speaker or facilitator come to the line, please let them through because they need to eat and prepare for the next session. And if you want the vegetarian option, please let the volunteer at the door know that you're looking for the vegetarian food. Thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for your questions and participation.